So this is a presentation on Chapter 7, the skeletal system. So the thing about the skeletal system, people are used to seeing skeletons and bones and think of them as hard, kind of permanent objects. They last for a long time. You know, you can dig up old bones and etc. But those are dead, crumbly kind of impressions of bone. In the living body, bones are very metabolically active. They are living tissue. It's connective tissue, primarily. Now, one of the things that we have to get clear right off the bat is that when we say bone, we're talking about the tissue. If we say each bone or the bone or a bone, we are talking about an organ. So the humerus is a bone, and it's made up of various types of tissue: bone, cartilage, connective tissue, blood, nerves, etc. So unfortunately, bone, the tissue, and a bone, the organ, get confused a lot. So what do they do for us? Well, primarily they keep you from becoming a puddle of soft tissue on the ground. They're all about support. We use them for locomotion, for movement, by attaching muscles to them. They act as the levers in a leverage system. Protection is a big thing. So our spinal cord is encased in the bone of the vertebrae. Our brains are encased within the skull, a series of bones. Our ribs protect our lungs, etc. So the protection is huge. Bones have got lots of spaces in it, and this is where the bone marrow is. And in the spongy bone near the ends, it's called red marrow, and because this is where blood cell production happens. We'll see in further videos in a few weeks how blood cells are produced. But suffice it for now that it happens within the bone. Bone also is a storage reservoir for minerals, for inorganic salts, especially calcium. If we have a low blood calcium level, we dissolve it out of the bones and we raise the blood calcium. If we have more than calcium than we need, we store it in the bones. So it's like the bank account for most minerals. Okay, there's a couple of different types of bones within the skeleton. There are long bones, and long bones mean that they are longer than they are thick, really. So the little phalanges at the end of your pinky finger is still a long bone. It's longer than it is wide. Arms and leg bones, so humerus, femur, radius, ulna, tibia, fibula, are all considered long bones. There are short bones. Now, these are little, like they're almost cubic in shape, almost equal in length and width. So the carpal bones of the wrist, the tarsal bones of the ankles are considered that. There are special short bones called sesamoid bones because they look like a sesame seed. They develop within the tendon, and their job is to change the direction of pull. They act like a pulley. So your kneecap is the example of a sesamoid bone. There's a couple other at the base of your big toe, on the ball of your foot, and often at the base of your thumb. More than you would realize, there are a bunch of bones that are flat. These, it says plate shape, but really they can be ribbon shaped. So your ribs are considered flat bones. Your shoulder blades, the scapula, all the skull bones are flat bones. Most flat bones have got a curve to them, but they also have this flatness. And then anything that's not long, short, or flat is considered irregular. So some of the facial bones are irregular, vertebrae are all irregular, etc. So we look at a kind of this stylized long bone. So at either end of a long bone is an area that develops and will become part of a joint with adjacent bones, and these are called the epiphysis. At the end closest to the root of the limb, so at the closest to the body, is the proximal epiphysis. The other end of the bone is the distal epiphysis. Articular surfaces are covered in a hyaline cartilage because hyaline cartilage is very smooth. It's almost like Teflon, and it reduces friction. And we'll talk about that more in the next video when we talk about joints. The shaft of a long bone is called a diaphysis. Now, the bone itself is made of bone tissue, but there's a dense layer of connective tissue that surrounds and covers the bone, and it is primarily collagen fibers, and this is called the periosteum. In the middle of the diaphysis, there is really no force. The tensile force and the compressive forces cancel each other out. So there's no need to have any material there, no bone. On the WebEx meeting, we'll demonstrate this. But so because there's no need for bone, we might as well make it hollow, and we call that the medullary cavity, the cavity in the middle. It's lined with a layer of connective tissue that's exactly like the periosteum, peri around, but this is endosteum inside. And then the cavity is filled with something called yellow marrow, and yellow marrow is really fat and some proteins. It's just a storage space. It's the stuff that we use to make soup when you buy marrow bones to make soup. Okay, every bone, and we're going to see in a minute, bone grows in relation to the stresses placed upon it. And so every place where a muscle is attached, there are stresses placed there. And what a bump will grow, and the bump will get bigger, the more often it's stressed, and the stronger the stress. So we call these things processes. There are also some grooves. There's openings, little holes. They all have names. There's the shape of the bone allows the joint to function. We'll talk about that in the next video. And all of this stuff has names. At this level, and in pre-health science, we don't get into all the different parts of every bone. In various courses, you'll have to be able to name every one of those projections, processes, holes, and grooves, and things. They are all named. Bone comes in two varieties. There's compact bone, as we discussed last semester when we did tissues. There's compact bone, which is a very dense, tightly packed, and it makes up kind of a crust, the outer wall. But to save weight, inside is really like trusses. It's filled with spongy bone, which looks like sponge toffee. And it's a series of little bony plates called trabeculae with spaces in between. The spaces are filled with marrow, but nevertheless, it's a weight-saving device. Now, you've all seen this when you look at a pork chop or a T-bone steak or something. You'll notice that the center of the bone is very spongy looking, and then there's kind of a rind around the outside of the bone that is much more solid. The outside rind is the compact bone. The inside spongy bit is the spongy bone. So if we look at this picture, you can see spongy bone up here with compact bone all around it. This is the proximal epiphysis of, this happens to be a femur. This is the diaphysis from here to here, and here at the knee is the distal epiphysis. The center is of the diaphysis has the medullary cavity where blood vessels and yellow marrow are. It's lined with an endosteum here. There's a periosteum surrounding the entire bone. On the joint surfaces, like right here and up here at the head of the femur, it'll be covered with articular cartilage, a hyaline cartilage. And we have these little bits of, they're like little plates, and these are called the epiphyseal plates. When we talk about bone growth, we will see them in more detail, but in an adult bone, they are just a little layer of compact bone that's really almost the scar of the growth plate. In a child's bone, these epiphyseal plates are made of hyaline cartilage, and they allow the bone to grow in length. If we look, this is a cross-section through the diaphysis, very close to the epiphysis. You can see that this is compact bone around the outside, spongy bone in the center, and a medullary cavity in the very center. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time with this because we did it in the tissue part of last semester. But in the compact bone, the bone cells are called osteocytes. Now, there's osteocytes in the spongy bone, but they're not organized like this. And every osteocyte lives in a little hollow space filled with interstitial fluid called a lacunae. It's the same word as lagoon. Now, in compact bone, all the lacunae are arranged in circular patterns, concentric circles, around a central canal, and they form layers called lamellae. Now, the central canal is often called the Haversian canal, and this is where the blood vessels and the nerves pass, and they feed all of the osteocytes within their lacunae from that central canal. And the oxygen-rich fluid flows out through these little cracks called caniculi, which means little canals, to the lacunae, and all the waste products of metabolism from the osteocytes flow back through the caniculi, back to the Haversian canal, where they enter the capillaries and end up in the veins. Because this is connective tissue, most of what you're looking at is not cellular, but is in fact extracellular matrix. Now, as you remember, the composition of the extracellular matrix is what gives each connective tissue its distinctive features. In dense regular connective tissue, it's mostly collagen fibers running parallel to one another and very little ground substance. In dense irregular, they're running in all different directions, but still very little ground substance. In hyaline cartilage, there's a lot of ground substance, hyaluronic acid. It's almost like a jelly substance, but very few fibers. In bone, there's a lot of collagen fibers as the fibers of the matrix, and so it's very good for under tensile strength, and a bunch of mineral salts that really are the ground substance is very hard. It's mostly calcium phosphate, and its job is to provide a resistance against compression. So this extracellular matrix arranged in circles around the central canal with the lacunae and the osteocytes that are maintaining this extracellular matrix, all together in each kind of circle is called an osteon, and the compact bone is made up of many, many osteons. The central canals have horizontal openings that go to the next canal, and those are called perforating canals or Volkmann's canals. So it looks like this. Each osteon is this concentric circle with each of these lacunae having an osteocyte, most of it being extracellular matrix, collagen fibers, and hydroxyapatite calcium crystals, calcium phosphate crystals. A central canal with a nerve and two blood vessels. This is another osteon, this is another one, this is another. There's a perforating canal joining them up. In the center of the medullary cavity, all of these blood vessels come together for this central blood vessel. Okay, when we're born, well, actually, when we're a fetus, before we're born, there is no bone. It develops a little bit later. What we have, there's no bone tissue per se. There are bones, however. The bones are entirely made up of hyaline cartilage. They're like a template. It gives attachment for the muscles. So the fetal limbs are there, except it's hyaline cartilage. It's not as resistant to compression as bone. Lay people tend to say things like, oh, the cartilage turns into bone. It's not true. What happens is the cartilage is replaced by bone. The cartilage dies because it's a living tissue, and it's replaced with the living tissue bone. Now, this happens in two distinct methods. If it happens that the bone, the protobone, is made of hyaline cartilage and then is replaced with bone tissue, it's called endochondral ossification. Most of the bones in the skeleton come from endochondral ossification. However, there are some areas, like for instance the skull, where there's no hyaline cartilage. It is in fact a membrane. It is a dense connective tissue membrane. That's the protoskull, for instance. And what happens is that the membrane gets replaced with bone in kind of sheet-like layers, and it makes the bones of the skull. And this is called intramembranous ossification. This happens in the skull and in the clavicles. The collarbones happen intramembranously. There are some people that actually have a genetic problem with intramembranous ossification, and they have a disease called cleidocranial dysostosis, which means bad bones. They used to find work in circuses as the rubber man. They could touch their shoulders together and things like that because their collarbones were very flexible. I actually had a patient that had cleidocranial dysostosis, and perhaps one day we will talk about the details, what I learned from that guy. But it was very interesting, the adaptations he had to make for his own health and safety. So, intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. We'll spend most of our time talking about the endochondral version. So when we look at this X-ray of a fetus, you're seeing that the bones of the skull are starting to form here within this membrane, and that's intramembranous. These long bones are all endochondral. And you'll notice in the hands here that there's really, looks like no carpal bones. It doesn't look like the radius here and the ulna here are even attached to these bones here. All of this area here, the bones exist, however they exist as cartilage, and the same here and the same here. This baby, or this fetus, has an elbow. It's right here. It just happens to be cartilage. It hasn't yet ossified. The epiphysis is the last bit to ossify. The diaphysis of the long bones ossify first, and this allows for growth. Okay, I don't want to spend very much time with this, but basically the flat bones get formed by intramembranous. What happens is osteoblasts, and these are the cells whose job it is to lay down the collagen fibers of osteoid, the fibrous part of the bony tissue. A chemical reaction makes the salts deposit. The osteoblasts start to invade this membrane and basically take over and slowly turn into bone. This will make more sense with endochondral. So, to understand endochondral ossification, we have to understand a couple of things. As you may remember from the tissue section of last semester, cartilage is avascular. Cartilage doesn't have any blood vessels. And the chondrocytes, the cells, live in these little spaces called lacunae. They need nutrients. They need oxygen and nutrients brought to them. They need their waste products and their carbon dioxide taken away. Without circulation, this is slightly difficult. Now, cartilage is porous. It's almost spongy. And when you load a compressive pressure on cartilage, it basically squeezes liquid out of the cartilage, the same way as squeezing a sponge pushes the water out of the sponge. And then when you relax the pressure, the cartilage expands again, and it sucks fresh liquid in to the space. It's called sussication. And it's exactly the same as if you have like a dirty sponge And what you do is you put it in a bucket of water and you squeeze it, and you squeeze the dirt out of it and squeeze clean soapy water back into the sponge. You do that a few times, and what you're doing is you're constantly replacing the cleaning solution within the sponge. Cartilage does the exact same thing. In order for cartilage to get nutrients, it needs to be loaded and unloaded. So walking will load the cartilage of your knees, squeezing the liquid out. You lift your foot, and now there's no pressure. The cartilage bounces back and sucks fresh liquid in. That's what you need to keep cartilage healthy. As you can imagine, bone doesn't do the same. Bone is highly vascular. So what happens is, there's a couple of other concepts. I'll just throw them out and then we'll put them all together. There is a phenomenon in physics called piezoelectricity. And what piezoelectricity is that if you put a force on a crystal, you get an electric current. Conversely, if you put an electric current on a crystal, it deforms and creates force. That's how quartz watches work. The battery provides an electric current on the quartz crystal, which makes it vibrate, which moves the mechanism of the watch. It's how ultrasound works. By putting an electric current on a big quartz crystal, you end up developing ultrasound. It's how radios used to work, but that's neither here nor there. Old record players, the needle moving up and down in the groove would put force on the crystal in the cartridge and make an electric current, which you amplified, and that's where the sound came from. So this is a well-established idea. It's called piezoelectricity. So whenever you put force on a crystal, you create a little bit of an electric current. Now I'm going to tell you a story that's an aside that will help you understand how bone is laid up. Beavers don't like the sound of running water. And the way beavers make their dams is they put sticks and mud wherever they hear the sound of trickling water. And the water builds up behind, and then the low spot, the water flows over, and the beaver puts more sticks and mud there, and then the water trickles in a different place, etc., etc. And the dam gets built not by any plan of engineering, but just by following a simple rule. Put mud and sticks where the water is trickling. Osteoblasts are like little beavers. What they do is they lay down osteoid, they lay down matrix for bone anywhere where there's piezoelectricity. And the more piezoelectricity, the more the osteoblasts make bone. So if you picture the hyaline cartilage, say a humerus in the arm of a fetus, what's going to happen is as the fetus starts to move, as the muscles attach, that humerus is going to have forces applied to it. And where the forces are going to be the greatest is in the center of the shaft of that piece of cartilage. And therefore there will be some piezoelectricity. So osteoblasts will lay down bone to try and stop that from moving. What happens then is a collar of bone gets put around the outside of that cartilage until that cartilage is encased in bone, and now it doesn't move. There's no forces. The forces are in fact on the bone. that's been laid down, which makes that bone grow, but it also means that the cartilage in the center is getting no nutrients and oxygen, so it dies. And as it dies, it starts to crack, and as it cracks, the osteoblasts move into the cracks, blood vessels move into the cracks, and what happens is in the center of that shaft, in the center of that collar of bone, will grow what's called the primary ossification center. It's spongy bone in the center of the diaphysis. And as the bone becomes more rigid, the cartilage at either end starts to get more and more force and more piezoelectricity. So osteoblasts lay down more and more bone, and the whole bone grows in length. It also grows in width because the periosteum around the outside starts to lay down more and more compact bone. A little while later, in the epiphysis, because of the forces, that cartilage starts to die, and you get secondary ossification centers. And between the diaphysis and the primary ossification center and the secondary ossification centers in the epiphysis, you end up with a band of hyaline cartilage. It's called the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate. And this is where the bone will grow in length. Now, there are basically three types of cells involved in bone. There are osteoblasts that make bone. Think of them as a construction crew. There's osteoclasts, which break down bone and replace old. They basically are like macrophages that eat bone, and they remove old, worn-out bone. Osteoblasts replace it. And then the osteocytes that live in the lacunae are almost like the janitors. So the osteoblasts build, the osteoclasts tear down, and the osteocytes maintain. The bone will continue to grow in length until the epiphyseal plate turns into bone. And once that happens, the bone can no longer get long. And so that's the end of growth of height. Now, because there is no forces and no piezoelectricity in the center of the bone, the osteoclasts work faster than the osteoblasts, and they end up carving out a hollow medullary cavity, which then fills with bone marrow. For most of our adult life, the osteoclastic activity and the osteoblastic activity balance each other out. We are constantly removing bone and replacing it. When we're children, the osteoblasts work faster than the osteoclasts, and when we're elderly, the osteoclasts work faster than the osteoblasts, and that's why elderly people end up with osteoporosis and brittle bones. But for most of our lives, there is a balance between the two. So here's what I've just described. Hyaline cartilage model, calcification forming in here, hardening, and bone developing as a collar around the outside. As the bone develops on the outside, the cartilage dies, gets replaced by bone. We have the primary ossification center, which grows. The secondary ossification centers start until we start to have something that looks like an adult bone. The epiphyseal plate is the growth plate that allows the bone to get longer, and then the adult bone has stopped growing in length. So when we look at an x-ray of a child, now this child looks like it's about 6 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 years of age, because they basically get one of these carpal bones ossified per year. But you'll notice that this is the epiphyseal plate of this metacarpal. Here, there's another one. It looks like little blobs of bone off the end of the bone, but it's really the growth plate of this whole thing. So what controls this level of bone deposition is really hormones. Throughout your life, various hormones are controlling it. Growth hormone makes the osteoblasts work more. Testosterone and estrogen also make the osteoblasts work. It's one of the reasons why men tend to be larger boned than women. It's because men make testosterone constantly after puberty. Women, estrogen levels rise and fall with the cycle. And postmenopausally, when estrogen stops, is when women become at risk for osteoporosis. The other thing that controls is the amount of piezoelectricity. So the more active you are, the denser your bone becomes. Nutrition is a big deal. Vitamin D is very necessary to provide enough calcium to make bone grow. Kids without vitamin D get something called rickets, where their bones are soft. There's lots of collagen fibers, but very little mineral salts. In adults, that's called osteomalacia. The hormonal secretion, the sex hormones and the growth hormone, and physical exercise. We'll end this video here and pick up at bone function in the next video.